Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. It's been some time since we at Brussels Sprouts have focused on China, a country that not so long ago was front and center in transatlantic strategy discussions. When the Biden administration took office in 2021, aligning US and European approaches to China was at the top of the agenda. But Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 reshaped priorities, drawing much of the transatlantic community's attention to Europe's eastern flank. Still, China has remained a persistent and increasingly complex challenge. Beijing's support for Russia during the war hardened some European views, yet Beijing is now making moves to rekindle relations with Europe, presenting itself as a useful hedge against a less reliable and less predictable United States. Beijing, for example, lifted sanctions on members of the European Parliament first imposed in 2021 in retaliation for EU sanctions over human rights abuses. The move is widely seen as an attempt by Beijing to thaw relations ahead of a meeting in Beijing in July. With US trade officials meeting with their Chinese counterparts in London today, which is the day that we're recording, I'll put that timestamp on, European leaders are also watching carefully how US relations with Beijing will evolve and what the US-China relationship will mean for Europe. And to discuss these issues, we're very pleased to have with us Liz Economy and Noah Barkin to help unpack this evolving transatlantic dynamic on China. Welcome to you both.
Good to be
Thanks,
here.
Andrea.
Brief introductions. Liz Economy is a principal with West Exec Advisors and senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. And Noah Barkin is a senior advisor with Rhodium Group's China practice and a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Okay, Noah, I want to start with you. And again, we said this has been a persistent issue. And so I think it would be useful if we could actually rewind time, go back and set the table for listeners and have you talk a little bit about the recent history of Europe's relationship with China. And as I mentioned in the intro, the Biden administration was very focused on trying to align US and European views and policies on China. That was a big push, a big priority. So can you talk to us about how successful they were over those 4 years and kind of how you would characterize Europe's relationship with China once Trump comes into office?
Sure. Thanks so much for the invitation. Always love joining Brussels Sprouts. I think there was, so when Biden came into office, there was, as you might remember, just weeks before that, a decision by the EU to move ahead with this comprehensive agreement on investment with China, the CAI, as it was known. And so that was certainly, and this was really driven by Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. So I would say this was a bit of a early bump in the road. Jake Sullivan came out and tweeted that, sort of made clear that he wasn't too happy with this. But within months, that agreement had sort of blown up, and the EU introduced sanctions on Chinese entities related to Xinjiang, and the Chinese side responded by sanctioning members of the European Parliament, prominent think tanks, academics. So I would say after that, the EU and the US we were sort of back on track on China, and a lot, I think, happened. Structures were created, the Trade and Technology Council, an EU-US dialogue on China. I think crucially, the EU and the US started using the same language on China, the language of de-risking, which the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen used in a speech, and Jake Sullivan and others in the Biden administration started using this language. I think too quickly for the Europeans' liking, because they were worried if the US embraces this, then some people in Europe aren't going to like it. So that was interesting. von der Leyen's cabinet had a very close relationship with people in Biden's entourage. Von der Leyen's chief of staff, Bjorn Seibert, had a very close relationship with Jake Sullivan. So a lot was being done behind the scenes. Von der Leyen really modeled, for a while, was modeling the European approach to the Biden administration's approach. She launched a discussion on outbound investment screening, for example, launched an economic security strategy. So things were moving in the right direction. I think probably I would say we didn't accomplish as much as we should have. There was a debate about green steel and aluminum deal between the U.S. and EU that never came together. There was a debate about a sort of cooperation on critical raw materials, which didn't come together. So positive signals moving in the right direction, but perhaps fell a bit short of what some people had hoped. So this was the situation when Trump came into office. And, the EU-China relationship right now is strained. It's strained because of two main reasons. One, concerns in Europe about an influx of cheap Chinese goods, Chinese overcapacities, threatening European industry. And two, China's support for Russia. And none of these issues have been removed, just because Trump is sitting in office. So the strains in the EU-China relationship remain in place. But of course, and this will be my final point, I think the EU, because the Biden administration's policy on China was quite predictable, you knew where they were going for the most part. It made it easy for the EU to sort of respond to this and shape its own strategy in reaction and in coordination with the U.S. And I think that is what has gone. We don't know where the Trump administration sits on China, and that adds some questions about where the EU is going on China.
Well, Liz is going to tell us where the U.S. sits on China. That was going to be my next question, which is so kind of that excellent overview, a very helpful reminder. I forgot about the CAI kind of right at the beginning of the Biden administration.
We've all been trying to forget about it since it was launched.
Excellent laydown to kind of get us up to this moment. And so the elephant in the room, or one of the big factors that I think is shaping Europe, is how they perceive what the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis China. So lots of questions on that front. And Liz, you're going to make it crystal clear on which direction this administration is going on China.
I think I want to be a Europe expert on China instead. Can I just take Noah's job and he can take my job? Let me just add one or two things to what Noah said, because I was in the Biden administration at the Commerce Department for a few years as Secretary Raimondo's senior advisor for China. And I would just say that I think we saw a lot of forward movement, not just positive signals, and some of that was not necessarily with the EU per se, but for example, there was the mineral security partnership with some countries in Europe. It wasn't the EU, but there was, an effort to align on supply chains, to forge an agreement so that we could ensure that we had access to critical minerals, because China commands so much of the supply chain, and to do deals with some of the mineral-rich emerging economies. So I think there was that element of it. I think there was also alignment, although not partnership, I think, as Noah was indicating, on the issue of Chinese overcapacity. It's just we addressed it differently. The Biden administration, put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, whereas the Europeans did a much more, sort of detailed, focused, and they did policy analysis instead of politics, quite frankly, to try to understand the actual level of subsidies that China was putting into EVs, and to come up with, I think, Noah, you can remind me, was it 30 or 35 or 40% tariffs on Chinese EVs? I think the upshot of that is that we're going to have a market that's largely closed to Chinese EVs, whereas the Europeans will not. But anyway, I just wanted to note that there was increasing alignment, at least sitting here in the United States. I think the way we perceived it, alignment of interests and understandings about the challenges that China posed, and some efforts to work together fairly concretely.
Yeah,
In
and
terms of where,
complementary was a big word too, right? We weren't going to be
yeah,
in lockstep on every issue, but as long as what we were doing was complementary, I feel like there was a big focus on that piece too.
yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Of course, we want the Europeans to be lockstep, but we have to respect strategic autonomy. In terms of where the Trump administration is going, I think, at the outset, it was a little bit confused. I mean, it still is a little bit confused. I think there was a sense the president came in. What did he talk about? He wanted to do a big deal with China. That was kind of his impulse was toward that. There was talk of spheres of influence, right? That this was going to be the United States sort of geostrategic orientation, which suggested to a lot of analysts that somehow the United States was going to focus on North and South America. It was simply going to give, Russia, Europe, especially given what the U.S. Was doing in terms of Ukraine, and then that China was going to be, the dominant power in the Asia Pacific or the Indo Pacific. Um, I think that that's changed. I think there's been some more clarity, not in terms of a real articulation of the US strategy toward China, but I think if you look at the moves that the administration has made, you can begin to sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together. And I think it's a little bit different, the picture that emerges today, than the one that we might have understood at the very beginning of the Trump administration. So, what do I think the puzzle looks like? I mean, obviously, we've taken a very tough line on the trade front with the tariffs. The president and his team have demonstrated that they are willing to go toe to toe with Chinese to ratchet up the tariffs. I think certainly there was a bit of a miscalculation on the administration's part in terms of the relative balance of dependence, of trade dependence between the US and Chinese economies, where I think, Secretary of Treasury Bessent at one point said, well, we import 5 times as much from China as China does from the United States. Therefore, we have the leverage. But that's simply not the way that it works. There are other factors. There are level of sort of trade dependence in terms of like sole commodity trade dependence is higher. So we're dependent on China for in terms of 30% of the goods that we import, we have a 70% dependence on China for those goods or more. China doesn't have that same level of sort of sole source dependence on US imports. And so that's a difference that we see. And obviously, we see right now playing out what China's doing in terms of the restrictions on rare earth elements and magnets that are very essential to our industries, both in terms of our technology industries and also our defense industries. So there are a variety of factors that play into this. People talk about China's ability to withstand the pressures of the economy, that they can bear more pain than we can. I think that's another factor. But in any case, we can talk about that more if you like. But I think on the economic front, generally speaking, we've taken a tough line with China, and that's playing out, as we speak. On the security front, I think that's where things, where we haven't seen a clear articulation necessarily of U.S. policy, but where I think we're seeing some real continuity with the first Trump administration. And that is to say that, the first meetings of and the travels, the trips of Secretary Hegseth and Rubio and former National Security Advisor Waltz were pretty much all with our Asian allies and partners. And so you saw Secretary Hegseth and Waltz travel to the region. Secretary Rubio's very first meeting with foreign partners was with the Quad at the State Department, the Quad members, Australia, India, and Japan. So I think there were these signals being sent, but we didn't necessarily put them together in a way that suggested that we were not actually prepared to cede the Indo-Pacific to China. And then we just had Secretary Hegseth's comments at Shangri-La Dialogue, where he, talked about Taiwan as essential. And so I think that also, sort of puts a different twist on the administration's orientation, again, in ways that I think many people didn't anticipate. I'll just finish by saying, of course, all of this depends on whatever it is that President Trump decides to do. And so, I would never say that what Secretary Hegseth said at Shangri-La is a signal that the United States, if China were to take military action against Taiwan or to blockade Taiwan, that the United States is, going in with guns blazing. That decision is going to rest with the president. And I think it's very much up in the air, President Trump's commitment to Taiwan, to broader Indo-Pacific security and the US role there. So, but I think to the extent that he has not focused on it himself, we see actors with very traditional foreign policy orientations, the US continuing to lead in the region. We see them filling the space in ways that I think are probably giving our Asian partners and allies some sense of security.
That's super helpful. Because I want to hear then from you, Noah, how Europe is interpreting, understanding these developments. But Liz, it would be really helpful too, and I'm sure listeners would really appreciate, to the extent that you can, talk about maybe some different views within the administration, because it does, I mean, as you've suggested, they're not all in lockstep and all have kind of a singular view on how US-China relations should develop. And there do seem to be kind of competing ideas. Can you talk, to the extent that you have insight, about kind of different pockets or different poles within the administration that might have slightly different views on the
Sure.
relationship?
Sure. And I think when Elon Musk was in the administration as a senior advisor, he certainly represented, I think, one pole or one, part of the spectrum in terms of the trade relationship. I think he, saw trade with China overall as a positive. And thought the tariffs were, a big mistake, as he said publicly. I think from there, I think you go all the way over to Peter Navarro, where I would say it's not simply about strategic decoupling, which is where I think the administration has, roughly speaking, landed, which is to say, we want to ensure that whatever trade investment we do with China protects our economic and national security and our human security as well. But I think Peter Navarro, how you define that universe can differ greatly. And I think for Peter Navarro, he would say that, actually exporting soybeans to China helps to feed the PLA, and therefore we should maybe not be doing that, right? The People's Liberation Army. And so I think his idea, it comes closer to real just decoupling of the two economies. And I think that that's not just, frankly, a Trump administration. That doesn't just represent one part of the Trump administration. I think there were people in the Biden administration that I think were close to that point as well, that really didn't think that economic engagement with China, whether we're talking Starbucks lattes or Nike sneakers, in the end, that we needed to be there. And so I think that view is there, but I think that battle has been, for the moment, won by the sort of middle contingent of strategic decouplers. I think on the security front, border security is the number one priority, and then I guess Indo-Pacific security has become number two. I think the idea of retrenching the United States doesn't need to be out there on the global stage. That we need to take care of ourselves first, and this global military presence and this burden is too great, and that's part of the argument for why we've really retrenched in terms of our support for Ukraine. I think that still exists, and that's also I think going to be an issue if and when Taiwan becomes, conflict with over Taiwan becomes a real issue. And I don't think there's been, as far as I can tell, any resolution within the administration between those who believe Taiwan is not a national security interest for the United States, and those who believe that it is. And then finally, I guess I think, and I haven't mentioned this, is just the issue of broader US political leadership on the global stage. And, the United States has traditionally been probably the most important country when it comes to leading in support for things like the rule of law and transparency, broader good governance. US establishes itself as a political model globally, democracy promotion. The Biden administration had, I think, 3 democracy summits. I think this administration has taken that totally off the table. And even Marco Rubio, who I think we all recognize in his heart of hearts, has been a very strong supporter of democracy, of groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, has, pulled off the State Department website. Frankly, something I found shocking, has pulled down that the U.S. will continue to support free and fair elections and the freedoms for people globally. I mean, I find this really remarkable that this is what we've come to. So I think that pillar of U.S. leadership, I think this administration has completely eliminated. And and in some respects, that provides new opportunities for cooperation with China, because we are no longer going to be pushing China to do the right thing in terms of their human rights, in terms of their practices on the global stage, it seems.
Yeah. Last question, and then Noah, over to you. There's a lot of concern, I think, in the US and amongst others that, like, if Beijing were to ratchet up pressure on Taiwan and, assert itself, that there could be kind of like a wink and a nod and kind of an acceding to Xi Jinping over Taiwan. Do you believe that would be the case?
Yeah, sure. I think that that would certainly not be the preference of most cabinet members, certainly not the national security members of the cabinet. I don't think it would be the preference of Congress, which has been a very traditional, strong supporter of Taiwan. But I don't think anything is off the table when it comes to President Trump. Now, you could make the argument that he doesn't want to be the president who lost Taiwan. I heard somebody in his administration, told me very directly that the president doesn't want to give Xi Jinping what he wants most. But those are not very deep or principled sort of reasons. We can't really hang our hats on those as sort of fundamentals for understanding what President Trump may or may not do, I don't believe. And so I think for a president for whom sort of everything can be on the table, and then you put things on and you take them off and you see what you can get, I'm not comfortable saying that you couldn't have that wink and nod. But I think he would face a lot of backlash again from members of Congress, and a lot of pushback from people within his own cabinet.
Yeah, it is hard. I mean, those statements are hard because you hear it on the Ukraine side too. Like, oh, he's not going to want to look weak early in his administration. He doesn't want to lose a war to Putin, et cetera, et cetera. And that hasn't really carried a lot of water so far.
Yeah, let me just say one thing to that point. And I'm sorry, I've dominated this discussion, but I do think there's a difference between the way the president looks at Putin and the way that he looks at Xi Jinping. And I think the entire sort of reverse Kissinger, reverse Nixon, effort at the outset, which I know we both agree was not going to go anywhere. But the idea that you would pull Russia away from China, it wasn't about pulling China away from Russia, right? It was Russia away from China, I think suggests that even the president looks differently at Putin than he does at Xi Jinping, and at Russia than he looks at China. So that's just something to keep in the back of our minds. And even the orientation, again, toward our Asia Pacific partners, which is so much more positive than it is toward our European partners. So that's just, a little bit of a framing that's been in the back of my mind.
Well, to pick up on that point, and then Jim, you can hop in after this, but to get back to Noah, that the difference between kind of views and attitudes of Indo-Pacific partners versus European partners and allies is a really interesting point. And Liz mentioned this in her overview on the Shangri-La comments. I mean, that the speech by Hegseth was really notable in its difference from what he said when he went to Europe. And so can you talk a little bit again from like, how are Europeans understanding and interpreting what the Trump administration is doing with China and what the big concerns are?
Yeah, well, I think Liz said it quite well. There is a degree of confusion. I'm always struck when talking with EU officials how often, not just EU, officials in some of the big member states, how often they mention the risk that Trump goes behind their back and does a deal with China and leaves Europe sort of out in the cold. I always say I don't know what that deal looks like. I mean, clearly Geneva was all about just de-escalating from extremely high tariff levels. We did see a push in the first Trump administration for a big deal with China. They ended up with phase one. the phase one trade deal, which was a rather underwhelming, I think we would all agree, agreement, which essentially involved China buying soybeans and other U.S. products to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. But at the same time, it's clear that, as Liz said, Trump is a deal maker, and he invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. He has reversed course on TikTok. He is not focusing on human rights as previous administrations have. I've lost track of who's in the NSC and who's out, but we've had some. I think some prominent, certainly Mike Waltz, some prominent China hawks either pushed out or seem to be on their last legs. So there is some confusion about where the administration is going on China. Honestly, I don't think that has a big impact on how the EU is approaching China. I think I mentioned the problems in the relationship. We do have an EU-China summit coming up at the end of July, and we can talk about that in more detail, perhaps. But I think these issues that remain problematic for EU officials, for politicians in the member states when it comes to China, its support for Russia, the imbalances in the trade relationship, these aren't going away. In fact, I think they're arguably getting worse with Trump sitting in the White House for various reasons. So while there is this concern about Trump maybe overruling some of the more hawkish elements in his administration and trying to push for something with China, I just don't know what that looks like.
Well, hello to both of you all. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for appearing on the show. I something, Liz, that you said that really struck me, and I want to follow up on it and just start off by saying that in my mind, as I've watched Trump deal with the tariffs, and I think about just at least I'm not an economist, but I just keep thinking about the bad economics. At least what I studied macro, micro, macro in school, but it just seemed it was he would just his instinct and what he was saying and what his end goal was, bringing manufacturing to the U.S. and all this type of thing was just incredibly bad. And I kept thinking, well, the people around him at least seem to have a financial background. They seem to be hedge fund managers, but they seem to be at least probably maybe they took micro and macro too before they became hedge fund managers, right? The Depsec Death is one. Scott Bessett is one. There's others that have been given big jobs, and I keep thinking they know this is bad. Maybe they're afraid to tell this to the president. They don't want to get fired. They want to be part of the team. But late at night, they're up sweating it out, saying, "Jesus, this is just terrible." But then, and that was my assumption. I said, at least there's some people in there who know, who know. But when you said that the administration made that miscalculation on the Trump tariffs up front in terms of the volume and type of trade between the U.S. and China, and what Scott said, I thought, oh my God, he never took micro macro either. He's so my question for you all is, is my assumption going in there and my at least a little bit of a good feeling that people around him know this stuff, that maybe based on what Scott said, that these guys they might be hedge fund managers, but that's all they know is how to make money in some mysterious way. They're not really people who understand trade and economics, macro, micro. They're just these guys who are making money. I mean, tell me I'm wrong, and that actually these guys are brilliant economists and they're just very wealthy. But tell me, how could Scott make such a bad miscalculation? How could they do? How could he do it? I mean, explain him.
So I'll say one thing, and then Noah, you definitely weigh in. Kevin Hassett was my college classmate, And I have to say, he's actually a really smart guy, and he's written for many years about how tariffs are not the way to go. He's a very traditional Republican. It's like reduce taxes, and you can, sort of, do something about regulation. I mean, those are basically that's the Kevin Hassett platform. My sense is that's really actually also the Scott Bessent platform. I think you saw in that, as the sort of global tariffs were being rolled out, and you saw the huge and negative reaction from, the US market, um, you saw both Kevin and Scott out there on TV getting a little bit ahead of themselves, saying, this is only about sort of the 15 or the 17, most important countries, the trade deficit. The rest of them don't matter. We don't have to go after Madagascar with its, selling us cinnamon and cloves or whatever, vanilla. But, just these 15 to 17 big economies. And then they got pulled back. And then ultimately they kind of won the day, I think. Right. So it's really about these, big economies. I mean, the UK deal, it's a country that we have a trade surplus with. I mean, it's so ludicrous. These guys clearly know better. I think Bessent's comment was really just to try to justify what they have to do, right? And that try to give some sense that the US is going in strong. I do believe that several of them know better. And Kevin has a PhD in economics. He's a really smart guy. That much I know. So but it's embarrassing, frankly, watching them out there on television spouting all of this stuff when, I know they know better.
But
They
it's
know they
even
know better,
worse.
but
I
I
think I'd
guess
rather
that's the
than be
job.
just absolutely stupid than to know better and to be getting on television and knowingly feeding us stuff that's not true. And that you guys who are brilliant economists, you see through it, but idiots like me sit there and go, oh, okay, But anyway, Noah, over to you. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think there is this performative aspect, right? They go on the weekend TV shows, whether it's Bessent or Lutnick or anyone else, and spout what Trump wants to hear. I would say I talked to a few Europeans who were at the G7 finance ministers meeting in Canada a couple weeks ago, and they were full of praise for Scott Bessent, saying that it was clear that he wanted to work with the Europeans. And he pushed for language in the G7 finance minister's statement, which said, and this was language that I think the Europeans had trouble with, but they signed up to in the end, about peak uncertainty being in the past, right? On tariffs and all this. And then literally within a few hours, Trump came out with his 50% tariff threat against the EU. So clearly this is not something that he had discussed with Bessent, and Bessent was in the dark on all of this. So I think the trouble is separating what they're saying to please Trump and the real policy, and what comes out in the mix at the end of all that. Rubio is another person who I think the Europeans were quite happy that he was sitting in the State Department as opposed to someone like Rick Grenell or someone like that. But if you look at what Rubio has done, he's creating an Office of Natural Rights, which as its main mission is to crack down on free speech violations in Europe, stuff like this. So there is this performative element. It's not just Bessent, it's not just Lutnick, it's also Marco Rubio, who is telling the MAGA crowd what they want to hear. It's an audience of one, basically.
I mean, that's the bigger point is, I mean, they're obviously from many different pockets and corners in the administration, just kind of sheer disdain for the EU. And now people are picking up this, the EU was created to screw the United States. All of this kind of culture wars stuff is taking on, gaining traction. And so I guess just to bring it back to the China piece, Liz, what do you think then China's play is? How are they viewing this, and what kind of opportunity do you think they sense? I mean, it is notable, or this is a question. Did they learn their lesson from last time that this wolf warrior diplomacy stuff doesn't work, and they've taken that on board and internalized it and are genuinely trying a new approach? But I'd love to hear both of you then about, you know, the view from Beijing and what
Could I add to that real quick?
they see.
And added to that, are the Chinese also, probably like Putin, also sitting there and scratching their heads about Trump and so uncertain of what directions he's going to take that they don't even know what their next step should be? I mean, the view from Beijing, does it include that, where where it's making their own decision making harder because they just can't judge where he's going?
So I'll offer a couple thoughts. I think the Chinese initially, especially after the rollout of the global tariffs, um, believed that they had a golden opportunity. And you saw them going off to Australia, saying, "Let's join hands." You know, going to Canada, going to Europe, and basically saying, "We are the responsible player. We are acting to stabilize the global economy. You know, we should all work together." Basically, in to counter the kind of chaos that's coming out of the United States these days. I don't think they had. Oh, then meeting with the Japanese and the Koreans. I don't think they had a lot of takers from the sort of the G7 world. I think there's openness to hearing what the Chinese have to say, but at the same time as they were out in Australia, they're doing these military exercises, these naval exercises between Australia and New Zealand, where they didn't tell them in advance, and so I think it's not as much the wolf warrior diplomacy. I do think overall that's been toned down, but it still comes out at certain points, that kind of lecturing and hectoring tone. Um, but I think that they continue. They'll say this sort of stuff. They'll try to make nice, but they continue to do whatever it is that they actually want to do to advance what they believe to be their own strategic interests, and they don't link the two very well, right? So they don't see that at the same time as they're trying to make nice and say, come into the China fold, they're doing things that signal to these same countries that they cannot be trusted. And so, while it might be military exercises for our Asian partners, it's definitely, as Noah suggested earlier, the continued support of Russia and Ukraine, that the Europeans look at that and say, we can't deal with you, the way that you want us to, until you take some action on this front. And so I think that's a big stumbling block to what the Chinese otherwise see as kind of a new open playing field for them, given all of the sort of craziness out of the United States. And then, sorry, the second question. So I
Yeah.
would say they're scratching their heads, but for the most part, I think they have a plan. And so here's the United States. It's doing what it's going to do. China has a set of responses. We've seen they've come back very quickly every time that the United States has put on a new tariff, put on a new export control. The Chinese have a set of retaliatory moves that they make, and that's how they're managing that process. It doesn't mean that it's not painful at some level. It's not annoying, but they can deal with that one after the other. And then more broadly, they have a big strategic game plan, right? They're busy diversifying away from the United States, diversifying their exports away from the United States. They're looking to the emerging and middle income economies. They're out in Africa. We, basically shut down USAID. They're in Cambodia, they're elsewhere, trying to fill the gap, in small ways. They're not going to spend the way that the United States spends, but they're going to, give some small donations to fill some important, some gaps that the United States has left in terms of its support for development needs in the most needy countries, and they're going to make huge announcements around it. They are going to be the saviors, and so again, this is really from their perspective. It's a golden opportunity, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, the turmoil that Trump engenders does make their economic path forward more complicated.
Yeah, Noah, you can add to that and then maybe bring us up to the EU China summit in July, kind of what both parties might be looking to get.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always thought that China's aim is not to pull Europe into the Chinese camp. I don't think it realistically thinks that this can happen. It's about preventing Europe from aligning too closely with the US. They love the term strategic autonomy more than Emmanuel Macron. So Trump is doing a lot of this work for them. He's supercharged the strategic autonomy debate in Europe. What does China want from the EU-China summit? I think there are a number of things. I mean, there's some practical stuff. They'd rather these EU duties on electric vehicles from China disappeared. But what I'm struck by when talking to people, including in recent days about the rare earth controls that China has implemented and which are affecting Europe as well as the US, is a joint statement from the summit which sends a signal of EU-China unity. So we're going to work out our trade differences. We support an open global trading system. We oppose protectionism. So I think this is what the Chinese are really pushing for. What does Europe want from this
Really
summit?
quickly on that, has there been a China statement on Greenland? Has there been a response on that piece of it?
Not that I'm aware of. No, not that I'm aware of. But I'm sure they welcome more statements to that effect. I think, the EU has a long list of grievances with China. They would like to see the removal of the retaliatory tariffs on cognac, threats by China to impose tariffs on EU pork and dairy. They want pledges from Beijing that the rare earths will continue to flow, of course. And they're also pushing for, and I'm not so sure how successful this will be, even if they get it, but there is a big debate in Europe about the conditioning of Chinese FDI in Europe. Liz mentioned the US market is closing down to a certain extent to Chinese FDI. Europe remains open, but the debate in Europe right now is Chinese FDI, yes, but only under certain conditions. So they want basically a reversal of what was happening in China for the past decades, technology transfer in electric vehicles, in batteries. They want to make sure that these investments are creating jobs. They want to make sure that that there's sharing of know-how, that Chinese companies are respecting certain cybersecurity and data security standards. So they are pushing China for some sort of pledge on the nature of Chinese investment. They still want market access for EU firms in China. But the grievances, the risk of overcapacities coming into Europe, China's continued support for Russia, I think this makes it very difficult. So I'm very skeptical that we will have anything that kind of blows our socks off coming out of this summit at the end of July in Beijing. I think one other important point to note is that the timing of this summit was deliberate on the EU side. They set it for roughly 2 weeks after this July 9th deadline. So they hoped to have clarity on the trading relationship with the US before they went into the summit with China. But I think it's very unlikely that they will have that clarity. I think this 90-day reprieve is likely to get extended. So the EU they'll be playing, sort of three-dimensional chess with a blindfold on with China. They won't know what the US relationship looks like. And they face these threats from China on, the weaponizing of dependencies on rare earths.
For both of you, what do you think the Trump administration's expectations of Europe are on China? I mean, so it's like, if we're going to keep helping you at all in Europe and maintain any kind of presence in Europe, hey, we expect you to kind of get on board and do what we're asking you. But, oh, by the way, we're doing the tariffs and all of these other kind of really difficult and confusing and complicated things. But like, if there were something positive to come out of the Europe-China summit, is that going to irk the Trump administration? Are they going to take a look at that and say, well, wait a minute?
I think I'll go quickly and then pass it over to Liz. I think there is some concern in Europe about the signal that this summit could send towards Washington, especially at a time when the US and EU are involved in trade negotiations themselves. But my sense is, and this is very different than the Biden administration, is that there hasn't been a big discussion that the Trump administration is pushing with the Europeans on China. I think the assumption is that the Trump administration will move ahead unilaterally, and it will expect the EU to follow, to get in line, and if it doesn't, it will go after the EU. So this is much less of the kind of discussion where the Biden team is sort of nudging the Europeans in the direction that it wanted them to be in. I've been surprised by the lack of a discussion on China between the Trump administration and Europe.
No, I agree with No. I mean, I think in certain areas, like on export controls, for example, the administration, not only wants but absolutely has to have, some countries aligned with its policy, and for the Biden administration, I think, as Noah suggested, that often took the form of, extensive discussions with the European partners, sometimes before an announcement of an export control from the US, sometimes after it. But nonetheless, there was just this huge effort expended to bring them on board. I think the Trump administration is much less interested in cajoling and persuading, and much more likely, as Noah suggested, to say, well, if you don't, then you will face some kind of, penalty. But it could be that there are other things going on, even now, around these export controls that I'm not aware of. I mean, we do know that part of the trade negotiations with third countries have, some of them, that the administration has talked about, moving the countries away from China, as in the supply chain. So basically saying reduce your dependence on China as well, right? That's part of our bilateral negotiation, is that you agree to reduce your trade with China. So in that context, you could imagine that some of these discussions with European countries might involve, and with the EU might involve some of that. But yeah, I don't think it's about partnership and coming together, and it's a shame, right? Because we do share so many of the same concerns about the way that China does business, about the openness of their own economy to our businesses, about the Made in China 2025 technologies, and the fact that we're going to be facing the same issue of overcapacity in a whole array of additional, goods, moving forward, like new materials and medical devices, et cetera. So there's a lot that we should and could be cooperating on, but that doesn't seem, as of yet, to be the orientation of this administration.
Yeah. I have one final tangent, Jim, unless you've got something else you want to throw in.
Well, I was just going to ask. Trump and van der Leyen had a supposedly a good conversation a week or so ago, and I was just wondering. I wonder what they talked about. But nah, let's don't even go there. So, Andrea, over to you.
I don't know.
Wait, I want to know.
Yeah,
I
go
want to know what
ahead.
they talked
No,
about.
what do you think? Any speculation?
No, I have no idea what they talked about. I think it's positive that they had a conversation. Trump refused to speak with von der Leyen for the better part of 4 months. Then they met briefly at the Pope's funeral, I believe it was. And so I think it's great. It was interesting. I thought that Giorgia Meloni, if I read this correctly, facilitated that conversation and encouraged Trump to speak with von der Leyen. I don't read this as some sort of the blossoming of a great relationship. I read it much more as a de-escalation between the EU and US. And I think the Trump administration has shown that it doesn't like the EU. The EU is the ultimate deep state. And it's going to be, you could decide whether it's just undermining the EU or out to destroy it, but it's not gonna be heading in a good direction, I fear.
Yeah, good point. Okay, my final tangent, it's related. We've already talked a little bit about it, but it's the Chinese support for Russia in the war. Do you think Europe has done enough to try to dissuade China from playing that role? I mean, we're so far into the war, they haven't shown any suggestion, China hasn't, of backing off from their support. And there was obviously a lot of hope and optimism at the beginning of the Biden administration that it really was going to be Europe that held the leverage with China. And yet that it wasn't effective. And I don't know, just to hear a little bit about your thoughts on what's shaping China's calculus at this point on why they're so willing to continue the support, and B, is there a role for Europe as they're going into the summit and other things of anything that you think that they can do?
Yeah, I think I don't think Europe has done enough, and I don't think Europe has been willing to sort of hold China's feet to the fire on its support for Russia. I think there was a lot of joint messaging from the EU and the Biden administration, and also a lot of the big member states, Germany and France, in particular, on this.
And Noah, why is that? Why?
Well, I think the EU, first of all, on these sanctions, you need unanimity among the member states, and so I think there's been a certain amount of reluctance on the part of the EU leadership to push member states into a place where they know they're going to be very uncomfortable. We have had 17 rounds of sanctions against Russia. For the better part of the past year, the EU has been adding Chinese entities to its sanctions list. So it's creeping up, but there was a push by the Biden administration, I believe, and Liz can confirm or deny this, but there was a discussion about sanctioning Chinese banks, and there was a discussion certainly between US and EU officials on this. The EU was never willing to go there. I don't know if the Biden administration thought about this and decided not to in the end. But this is a discussion, I think, which is going to come back. There's an 18th sanctions package, which is in the works. And the longer this goes on, especially I think if the Trump administration is pulling back from Europe, if it's pulling back its support from Ukraine, I think for the EU, China's support for Russia will become a bigger problem because the US won't be there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, Liz, anything you want to add?
No, I just, it's funny. Noah and I have been together at a couple of conferences with Europeans, Chinese, and Americans over the past 6 months. And I've just been struck at the extent to which the Chinese seem to believe that, once the war is over, they can just walk in and, do all of the reconstruction, get all the, get all the reconstruction work for Ukraine. And that's going to be their contribution, no matter that they've been, supporting Russia,
But I don't know
in
that Ukraine
its
will be
efforts.
opposed to that. I mean, I think that's the thing that's so remarkable is there's been so little pushback from Kyiv on China, and I think
Well,
maybe that's what they're hoping for.
I mean, I would guess, but I think Noah wants to say something. But
Yeah.
I would guess that the reason that they're open to it is because they're hoping that openness is going to somehow persuade China to do the right thing up front. But Noah, I would defer to you on this.
No, I would just say that there was an interesting line in the G7 finance minister's statement, which basically said that no country or company that has actively supported Russia in its war in Ukraine could profit from reconstruction. So I think that was in the critical raw materials
Yes,
deal between the
you're
US
right.
and Ukraine, and then it made it into the G7 finance minister's statement.
Yeah,
So I thought that was interesting.
great point. But Liz, go back and just really to pick up on what Noah said, kind of what the Biden administration had hoped Europe would do, and any kind of last words on China's calculus. I mean, you mentioned, they're hoping they're going to walk back in at the end.
Yeah, I think basically, at the very outset, Xi Jinping determined that his long-term strategic and China's long-term strategic interests rested more closely with Russia than it did with the United States and Europe. There was a lot of debate within China about this. A lot of Chinese analysts, said that the administration that Xi Jinping leadership was making the wrong decision, that this was a golden opportunity to align with the West. And they, that's not the direction in which Xi Jinping moved. And, frankly, Xi Jinping 3 times has said Putin is his best friend. He sees, their interests as very closely aligned. They work together across a whole spectrum of issues. Their trade has boomed as a result of this. So I think yes, Europe should do more in terms of pressuring China, but to be frank, I don't think there's that much that they could do to get Xi Jinping to move away from his support for Russia.
I actually have one more question, but I'll.
Oh, go, Jim.
Well,
No,
the
go,
question
go.
is,
Then go.
Liz, as you were talking about the relationship between the Xi and Putin, his best friend, and all this type of thing. I know that the Chinese have been, and this is my question. I think the Chinese have been helpful to us in the past when we needed to get a message or pressure on Putin not to do something like nuclear weapons, and having Xi carry some of our water, in quotes, with Putin can be a helpful channel. And my question is for both of you, does that really work? Do we call Xi and say, hey, could you put pressure on him not to blow a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine? Does Xi go to his best friend and say, hey, the Americans called me, they want you to cool it, I agree with them? I mean, does that ever work, or is that really a pipe dream that's that he is going to be helping us out, unless it's going to help him?
Right. I mean, I think that's the point right there, is that Xi Jinping was not actually interested in having Russia use tactical nuclear weapons. And, to be frank, credit for that decision is claimed by a Chinese researcher, former Colonel Intelligence Officer Zhuo Bo. And I think he wrote a piece in the Financial Times to this effect. And he believes, probably rightly, that that is actually what shaped the Chinese perspective. And I don't think that the United States can pressure China into anything. I mean, think about all the information we shared with them leading up to the war and our efforts. We couldn't even get them to help us out with the Houthis. And so I just don't think that there's that relationship. And certainly there's not that relationship between President Trump and President Xi, no matter what President Trump says.
Well, on that dire note, which is tends to be where we end our podcast, but like this was really wonderful. We haven't done China in a while. There's a ton there, and thanks for reminding us. I mean, it's such an important issue. There's so much happening. And I learned a lot from the discussion. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.